Hi there, and welcome back to Condo Q's. We're restarting because apparently our microphones weren't playing nice the first time around, so we'll start over.
Yes.
I'm Sandy Wagner with Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association.
And I'm Ryan Stenquist, founder of Condo Clear Services.
Right, and Condo Q's will be brought to you about every 2 weeks here 6:30 on every second and fourth Tuesday, as much as we can. And we are going to bring you about 10 or 15 minutes of information about a topic of interest to strata owners, and then we'll invite your questions for about 10 minutes after that. But you can always give us your questions at any time throughout. You don't have to wait till the end to give us your questions. We can see them popping up on the screen.
Perfect, and thank you, Kelly and Jessica, for letting us know that you can actually hear us now. I was saying some very, very intelligent, insightful stuff, but there is no sound apparently, so I'll try and remember what that was. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about sections and types, which is a especially fun topic in stratas.
It is, and so many of you probably don't even know what a section or a type is. Hence the reason for today's topic.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of people, unless you've lived in a section building, or you might even live in a section building and not fully understand what they are, or even realize it's a section building or a type building until you really get into the governance of it. It's something that when I first started in the strata management industry, not a lot of attention was paid to it. It's something that has been a part of the Strata Property Act, I believe, since its inception.
Exactly.
But quite honestly, it was something that management companies, councils really didn't pay attention to. No. There was a lot of buildings out there that were sectioned technically through their bylaws, but they weren't operating as a section building. And there is specific requirements that have to be fulfilled to be a section building, like separate bank accounts and management contracts and separate contracts.
Sounds really complicated.
Yes.
So what's your typical section strata look like, Ryan?
So where you see it often is mixed use buildings like commercial and residential. So you have a high rise with maybe 10 or 20 or 30 stories of residential, and then you have retail or restaurants or whatnot on the bottom. Well, in Vancouver, we don't really see it much in Victoria right now, but in Vancouver, you see a lot of buildings that are retail office space or retail space, office space above that, and then condos and residential above that even. Yeah. And and then you can get really complicated and get to hotels, which is a separate section.
Let's not talk about hotels.
So yeah, they can be very complicated. So you might be asking, what is the purpose of a section? What is the purpose of a type? Why have this complicated system in place? And the answer to that is easy. It's to try and separate out costs in a more fair manner.
So it's all about separating the money.
Absolutely, yeah. And some governance, of course, commercial owners typically have different priorities than maybe residential owners do. Or the other common place we see it is with condos versus townhouses.
Oh, right. If you have a tower of apartment style condos, and then you've got a townhouse along in front of it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So
different needs.
Having a section building would allow them to separate out certain operating costs, such as elevators, for instance, which the townhouses really don't have any use or any need of. So they're not paying for those expenses, which can be fairly significant sometimes, especially when it comes to modernization and replacement. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay, so that seems like a good reason to create sections.
Yes.
So how do they create the sections in the first place?
So sections through the bylaws. That's the best way to find out. You can have a section building that, you can have a non-section building that has townhouses and condos, or commercial and residential that's not sectioned. So ultimately, you have to look at the bylaws. And if it's not, and I have seen buildings that are operating as if they were section buildings,
but they're not.
But they don't actually have the bylaws to support them. And on the other hand, we've mentioned types and sections, because both of those mechanisms do essentially the same thing, or the intent is the same thing. Is they're meant to separate out those costs for different uses, let's say, or different construction types.
Yeah, so from what I understand about types, the financial and the governance is quite different than from sections.
Correct, yeah. So before we get too deep into what exactly a section is and what a type is, we'll talk about some of the differences first of all. Is sections are kind of the more complicated, higher level version of a type. A type is, like I was saying, townhouses versus residential. You can separate those out by type. The biggest difference with types is still under the control of the Strata Council. So there's still one council. There's one bank account or two bank accounts, the CRF, the operating account, one set of bylaws, all that, and you can only separate out operating expenses. So your CRF is still the same. You can't separate out long-term capital cost expenditures such as replacing the elevator. So you'd be able to separate out the operating costs,
the day-to-day.
So the monthly maintenance of that elevator, you can separate that out, no problem. But when it comes time to replace that elevator,
then everybody's chipping in.
Then the townhouse owners in that instance would still have to pay for that.
So that seems like a good reason to make a section instead of types.
Yes. Well, yeah, exactly. So that's where you get into sections now, which is the more complicated version of a type. And what's happening when you create a section is you're creating an entirely separate legal entity. So in that case, you have the Strata Corporation, which is kind of the umbrella, and then you have the sections underneath that.
Section 1,
Section 1, Section 2. They might be nicknamed residential, commercial, townhouses, etc. But the easiest way to think of that, or the best way I've found to explain this in the past with the councils that I've dealt with, is think of it as the government of Canada. Is you have Canada, which is the federal government, and then you have the provinces. So each section would be like a province, and then the Strata Corporation is like the government.
That's a really good way to explain it.
Yeah, that's I've explained this so many times that as soon as I start using the government,
that's why Ryan's taking the lead today.
As soon as I start using the government analogy, people tend to click and go, okay, well that makes a little bit more sense. Each section has its own individual responsibilities. Any costs that relate solely to that section will be separated out in their own budget. So
very own budget.
Separate councils, if you will. So there'll be the Strata Council, and then you'll have an executive, which is essentially another council.
Members for each section.
For each section, they will have their own EGMs, their own council meetings or executive meetings, their own budgets, their own management contracts, their own bank
they
accounts.
should have their own management contracts.
They should have their own management contracts. Going back to what I was saying, most of the buildings I'm seeing now are in compliance, but this has only happened really in the last 5-6 years.
The management companies weren't even aware that they needed to do it.
No, it was a section of the Strata Property Act that really was largely ignored. That was really largely ignored for a lot of years.
And not understood.
Not understood. So the Real Estate Council about 5 or 6 years ago went through a big push where they had lawyers going out and essentially training all the Strata management licensees on how to deal with section buildings and types and the differences and all that sort of good stuff. So one of the reasons that we're talking about this topic now is I've done a couple of reviews in the last couple of weeks on buildings that were types, but they were operating as if they were sections.
So they're operating with all these separate budgets, but they really didn't have the bylaws to allow that.
Correct.
Oh, gee.
Yeah.
No, that's a little messy.
so they were the biggest instance was both of these buildings that I've done reviews on. They both had big capital cost projects coming up, but they were pinning those costs. They were types buildings, but they were pinning those costs on the smaller entity at that point. So one of them was townhouses. The other one actually had about 6 different types based on the construction of the various buildings. But the townhouse one, the townhouse roofs were due to be done in the next year and a half.
And only the townhouse owners were going to pay for it.
Only the townhouse owners were paying for it. They were talking about having a special levy just for the townhouse owners. And I said to the potential buyer of that one, I said, well, no, this is something you need to talk to the Strata Council or the management company about, because this is an expense that should be shared throughout all the units.
Because they're not legally properly sectioned.
Yes.
If they were properly sectioned,
if they were sectioned,
then they'd be doing it
absolutely.
correctly.
Then they'd be doing it correctly.
Yeah.
Of course, with sections, obviously it is a little bit more complicated. With that complication comes additional costs, administration. Again, we mentioned that there's separate management contracts, so there's 2 sets of books, 2 sets of minutes. Even when I do reviews on section buildings, I do charge an extra fee because essentially I'm doubling up
the
work that's done.
Of course.
Yes. So there does come with additional costs, and it is more difficult to administrate. I'm sure many of you watching have been to AGMs. Imagine having to sit through 2 or 3 AGMs in one evening.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one thing that I know about sections that's quite often done wrong is creating bylaws.
Yes. Because
if the Strata Corporation's creating bylaws, they have to be voted on by both sections separately. if the sections creating their own bylaws, then only that section votes on them.
Yeah,
Is that right?
even then, the strata corporation still has to vote on it, as well as the section that it's affecting. And you can get, and definitely do not quote me on this, because this is where you get into some of the very complicated legalities surrounding sections.
Any lawyers on the line?
Can't see right now, but yeah, when you're passing bylaws, you have to be very careful that the appropriate parties are all voting on the appropriate bylaws, and the wording of those bylaws may very well be different somewhat as well to reflect the sections that
because a section can have bylaws for use control of their property, but not of the common property in general.
Correct.
Right.
But they still form a part of the strata corporation's bylaws.
Yes. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So I can see how it's easy to get it wrong. That's for sure. I think any strata that is doing it wrong would be forgiven if they get some legal advice and start doing it right.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I've had a great deal of experience in this area. I've managed some of the most complicated section buildings probably in BC, and still it's something that I often recommend people get legal advice on, because it's very easy to do something wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So when they're creating sections, so then each proposed new section has to vote to agree to do it, and then the strata corporation as a whole has to vote to agree.
So if you had townhouse owners, they would have their own individual say of it. If you have commercial owners, they would have to have their own individual say of it. So everybody essentially has to, not everybody has to agree, but everybody has to pass that 3/4 vote threshold in order to enact it. Now, on the other hand, and this happens fairly often as well, is a developer will set up a building as a section building.
Right from day one.
Right from day one. The owners get into place, and I've seen this happen in smaller buildings, especially where you have a 20 or 30 unit building that's section, and they look at the costs and the additional administration that goes into having a section building, and they say, well, this just isn't worth it. So then they repeal those sections and go back to operating as if it's a regular building, or they'll pass a types bylaw to at least separate out the operating costs. And the same thing, it's still 3/4 vote, same way you'd pass or repeal any other bylaw.
Okay, so repealing sections is as simple as repealing the bylaw.
Yep, it's strictly created through the bylaws.
Okay, good. I think I sidetracked you a bit.
A little bit. I think we've covered most everything that I want to talk about. One of the other things I will touch on, though, is conflict. Now, because you have separate legal entities, and again, these are all very separate legal entities, and there can be more than 2 or 3 or 4 sections. There could be really unlimited sections, as long as there are certain criteria under the Act that has to be met before they can actually section. Types of usage, so commercial versus residential, construction type, so townhouses versus condos. There can be heritage houses on site. And this is again more so popular on the mainland in the Vancouver area, but you'll have a condo building with apartments, townhouses, and then they might have a couple heritage houses that have actually been split up into units as well. So now you have 3 different, very distinct different properties there that might all have separate
They could all have their separate section executive, separate budgets.
And then you throw in a commercial level on the bottom floor, and then boom, you've got 4 different entities in there, plus the strata corporation itself. So you've got 5 different legal entities. So of course, with that, people aren't always going to agree. You're going to have 5 different councils or executives, and there can be the potential for conflict. So sections can absolutely sue the strata corporation. They can sue other sections. They can go at each other. One of the things that was happening as I was leaving the specific management part of the industry, was there some question about whether or not they required separate E&O insurance or directors and officers liability insurance, especially to deal with that. And if you think about it, it makes sense for them to have separate insurance. It was something that a lot of buildings didn't want to accept that extra cost.
Such a small cost.
It was about $1,000 a year was kind of what they were looking at. But it makes sense, because if you have a conflict between, say, the strata council and the residential executive, well, they're all covered under one policy. That's somewhat of a conflict of interest there.
So they wouldn't have their whole separate insurance policy, of course. No, just a separate,
just a separate E&O or D&O coverage. So that's one of the things that you need to be cognizant of as well.
Yeah, good point.
So that's a really rough and tumble overview of what sections and types are. Again, they are quite complicated. The biggest thing is, again, pay attention to the bylaws. Make sure that the meetings are separate, that they're minuted separately.
Separate budgets.
Yeah, separate budgets.
Separate banking.
And the easiest way to, typically in the bylaws, if it's a good set of bylaws that's drafted properly, it will have the difference in responsibilities, what the Strata Corporation is responsible for versus what the residential section or the commercial section is responsible for. But ultimately, as long as that section has sole and exclusive use of that particular component, then that's going to be a section expense. If it's something that's shared even a little bit, so say your exterior lighting, say exterior lighting on a building where there's residential and commercial, well,
you can't
the
divide
guys
up
on the
which
20th
light
floor
bulbs.
aren't going to benefit from the lighting on the street, but if it's all on that one circuit and part of the main electrical grid, then
the Strata Corporation,
Strata Corporation has to pay for that. So it doesn't matter if the benefit is 2%. It still has to be
if it's a
split.
shared expense. Okay.
There is ways to separate that out, of course, but again, I'm not going to get too deep into detail on that. Get legal advice, talk to an experienced property manager, and they should be able to help guide you through that process.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, do we have any questions?
We don't have any questions.
Do you have any questions?
Do I have any questions? I know a little bit more about sections than I let on because somebody had to ask the questions. But have you seen some examples where a strata has had their strata budget, their section budgets, and they've got it wrong and realized partly to the year?
You know, that's actually a really good point. Yes, I have seen that happen. The biggest time that I've seen that happen is when buildings are brand new. And what has happened to me personally that I've seen is that the disclosure statement that the developer files with the superintendent of real estate, quite often there'll be amendments to that disclosure statement, and they're not always the greatest at sending everything out, or the Strata Corporation isn't always the greatest of having all those on file. Well, through those disclosures, quite often you can have a change in the difference in unit entitlement.
Oh, right, yes.
So if you end up in a section building and there's a split SIG, and we'll use the commercial versus residential, and there's 14% unit entitlement for the commercial, and there's 84% or 86% for the residential, quick math. And something happens and they change that unit entitlement for some reason,
then they could be budgeted wrong.
There could be, and I've been through that where it was actually the second year before we got our hands on the updated Schedule V or Form V, Schedule of Unit Entitlement, and found out that difference had been amended.
Yeah, wow. Now that would be complicated. It's a good thing it was caught early.
Absolutely.
So a wee bit off that topic, but it kind of leads us into it. So what happens if you discover that you've done something wrong in the budget, section budget perhaps, you've been doing it wrong for a couple of years? What do you do?
Well, ultimately in that case, what I would suggest is disclose it to the owners. Obviously, transparency is huge. Depending on how big the discrepancy is, you may have to go back and reconcile those accounts. If people have been paying more than they should have, then there should be a credit there. If people have been paying less than they should have, then and this is where you run into issues, is people don't mind getting money back, but they don't want to pay extra money. But unfortunately, that's just the reality of the situation.
Okay. Have you had any personal experience with that?
I have not.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I'm sure it comes up.
Yes.
And as you said, if the discrepancy is very small, I think the owners would probably vote to just let the past be the past and move forward.
Yeah.
But if I'm entitled to $3,000 back, I'm going to vote no on that. I'm going to.
Absolutely. In those circumstances, that would be dealt with, of course, at a general meeting. And I would likely guess, and this is a situation where again it might be good to get legal advice. But I would. My initial thought would be you'd probably have to go through pass a new budget, which of course would be a majority vote, and that's how you deal with it. And just thinking again now on that question, I have ran into that situation, not necessarily in a section building, but I was involved, or I did a review on a building where the council at some point in the past had unilaterally changed their unit entitlement.
Oh no!
And whether or not they followed the proper procedure, we don't know. But it changed what the owners were paying, and there had been some significant special levies in that time since they did that. So, anytime you're messing with unit entitlement,
don't do it on your own.
No, absolutely get legal advice. That's a big one. So, in case you haven't noticed, this is I think the overriding theme of tonight is
Yeah,
legal
sections,
advice
types,
well,
legal advice.
is well worth
For
the money.
sure, for sure.
Make sure you do it right the first time.
Now, one thing you touched on is the need for separate management.
Yes.
And so there'd be a management for each section and an overriding management for the Strata Corporation. Would you suggest that they should be 3 different management companies or just 3 different agents within the same management company?
And
what is the real estate council?
That's a really good question. So there is some conversation about that. So as far as the conflict of interest, again, because you are dealing with separate entities which can be in conflict with each other, having one management company or one property manager could be a conflict in and of itself. Right. So from a strictly technical standpoint, yeah, you should have separate management companies for each contract, because ultimately you're not, the Strata Corporation isn't contracting with the individual manager, they're contracting with the brokerage.
That's right.
So ultimately the relationship is with the brokerage, so you should have 3 or more different brokerages involved. However, there's been a lot of pushback in practical terms from the strata management industry, and I think most strata owners in general would tend to agree, is trying to have 3 different management companies, would make your costs go up significantly. Significantly. Right now, when it's a management contract and they're managing the Strata Corporation as well as the sections, yes, you are paying more, but you're not paying, as much more. You're not paying $20 a door more. You're paying $5 to $7 or $8 a door more kind of cost. Whereas if that was a completely separate brokerage for each one of those, you'd be paying full rates for each one of those management contracts. So it wouldn't be very cost effective.
So it sounds like that hasn't all been really sorted out yet by the industry.
Yes, exactly. And then the second part of that is it makes things incredibly complicated. When you're dealing with 3 or 4 or more different parties, especially in smaller buildings, from a practical standpoint, it just doesn't make sense, especially because most of the time, the people that are on the Strata Council are the same people that are on their respective executives, and you have a lot of overlap there. So to have those people expect to have 3 separate meetings on 3 separate nights, or whatever the scenario may call for, it just, from a practical standpoint, it just doesn't make any sense.
So practicality, they probably have all 3 meetings on the same night.
Exactly, yeah, and you can just roll from one meeting into another meeting. When I was managing section buildings, I would always have separate agendas, of course. It was completely 100% separate. I know some management companies, even some managers that I worked with inside the firm that I used to be with, like to kind of blend it together. But again, it's complicated enough as it is, and it adds a level of simplicity when you just separate it out completely. Easier to understand.
And so we've just talked about simplicity, but really nothing about sections is simple. So again, as Ryan said, the overarching theme is get that legal advice when you need it, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, well, unless there's any questions, I think we've pretty much covered that topic in a general sense anyways. By all means, it's not all-encompassing, but
no, you can't learn everything about sections in 20 minutes, that's for sure.
No, definitely not. I went through a lot of seminars and a lot of personal experience before I built the knowledge base that I have today. Yes,
exactly. So what's coming up?
What's coming up? So, well, I don't have anything coming up, but somewhat exciting news is I have teamed up with Visoa and Sandy in particular to put on a workshop on April 27th.
April 27th is a Saturday morning. And it's for, it's called Before You Buy a Condo. So if you have friends who are thinking of buying a strata unit or a condo, we'll even tell them what the difference is between a condo and a strata, but the things that you need to know before you buy. All the things that you wish you knew before you bought, we'll tell people that beforehand. And so
especially getting the documents reviewed, that's the most important thing.
Well, maybe really
by a knowledgeable third party.
I don't think I know anybody. Who can we suggest?
There's really only one in BC.
That's true. And the other thing is we've got our Visoa seminar coming up in Courtenay on April the 7th, and that's all about Strata AGM. So if you've never really quite understood how to conduct your Strata AGM, we'll try and enlighten you on that up in Courtenay.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to miss that one. That's going to be the first
one I've missed in forever.
Since I became a member, a business member with Visoa. But
should be a good
we're
one.
going to Vancouver for a concert that weekend.
Who are you going to see?
Pink.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. That'll be fun.
She's awesome.
Yeah.
So pretty
so our next Condo Q, though, is only a couple days after that. It's on April the 9th. and our topic is going to be depreciation reports.
Yes.
And we all have them. At least I hope we all do. And if you don't, I'll slap your fingers at that session on April the 9th.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's depreciation reports. A few years ago, when they were first coming into play, it was a big topic. It was all over the news. All the papers had it. There was a lot of things that were said as far as buildings not getting mortgages or insurance, or you can't sell in buildings that had depreciation reports. So I think part of that is we will go over what depreciation reports are, because obviously that's important. I think most people have been somewhat inundated about it. There is a ton of information about it, but what I'd like to maybe get into a little bit is talking about some of those doomsday prophecies and maybe how they've actually come up, and what the situation is now in the market.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, that's why we've picked that topic for next time.
Great.
So I think we'll see you on April the 9th, right here, 6:30 on Facebook.
Absolutely. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.